So it's wonderful to be with you today, Jim. You are the John L. Colley Professor of Business Administration at the Darden School of Business in Virginia. But today you're coming in from London, down the road from me, and you're very, very welcome. Of course, we all know you as a global expert, a global guru on all things courage and ethics, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. I've been rereading your brilliant book, Choosing Courage, which is rightly praised, it's authoritative, it's practical, full of great stories, and your voice comes through. This is a topic clearly you care very deeply about. As well as the book, of course, you've been published in all the great top journals, and we're looking to tap into your wisdom today. So listeners can come away with not only a bit of the theory and thinking and research, but also a how do I be more courageous in my workplace or in life. So welcome to the show, Jim.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. So let's dive straight in terms of courage. I'm curious about organizations and how the context for an organization shapes how we are or we are not courageous. For example, at the moment, if you look at wherever you are in the world, it could be wars, it could be a difficult economy, there's inequalities. How much does that wider context shape how we show up at work?
Yeah, it's a great question, and while I'll try to not say to every question you ask me, it depends and give you 55 caveats, it does depend. It does, of course, depend some. Certainly, given speaking up is based largely on whether you feel safe to do so or not, depending on the repercussions. It's obvious that our context, the context not just within an organization, but the broader context matters. The reason I think it's a bit complicated is, we would tend to say some things like cultures matter, national cultures matter. And so hypothesis might be that, in the U.S. it's, we have more of a sort of individualistic sort of mentality, a sort of a First Amendment right to speak. And so you might think, in the U.S. people probably speak up more. It turns out if you look closely at that, it's not really true. And it's not true because there are elements of society that make a big difference in how free we actually feel. All rhetoric aside. And in the U.S., for example, the vast majority, 90% of folks, are dependent on their employing organization for health care, for their retirement savings,
yes.
And for all other sort of aspects of what is just the actual social safety net in other countries, right? In the U.K., of course, you have National Health Service. So these things affect a lot how safe people feel being willing to speak up, because you're not just at risk of potentially losing a job, but you're at risk of losing these obviously critical elements of your entire social safety net. So that makes a difference. And then, of course, as you allude to, the state of the broader economy matters. It's easier to speak up and take risks if you feel relatively certain you could get a new job relatively easily. It's easier to speak up, obviously, if you live in at least a democracy where, you might suffer social consequences at work, but you're not likely to be imprisoned or physically harmed like you might be in some places. So I think it does matter. It's just not as straightforward as we might assume, like, the more democratic the country, the easier it is to speak up. In fact, I did some data collection a few years ago, and I was actually surprised until I thought more deeply about it. But folks in the U.S. do not, on the whole, speak up appreciably different than in folks, let's say, in China and other places where we would expect a fairly significant difference.
That's fascinating. Well, it's a complex picture. I'm glad you've outlined those factors because it's quite easy to simplify. And I guess one of the things in the book you say is it's a personal choice and or responsibility. And obviously what affects you is what you sense and feel and what's real as well. But let's just drive on that theme a little bit more in terms of perhaps the context and the types of organizations, because it's pretty clear that in a toxic organization, whether the culture is toxic or it's underperforming or it's a difficult environment, that it may be hard, right, because of the repercussions you talked about. What about you go to the other end of the spectrum where you have a really high-performing, innovative organization that wins prizes everywhere? Is it easier to be courageous to speak up in those types of organizations than it is in the other end of the spectrum?
Yeah, again, I think I would say yes, but only in a really qualified way. I mean, yeah, certainly, right, if we point to an organization where highly overtly abusive bosses run rampant, people get fired left and right, for disagreeing. Yeah, obviously it's tougher there. it is, though, sadly the case that it's fairly hard to find these other kinds of organizations you were alluding to. Even some of the, the most sort of, high tech, innovative kinds of organizations in the U.S. I mean, they're sort of constantly now becoming under fire for their
Yes.
climate around sort of actual safety to speak up and their willingness to tolerate diverse thought and pushback. So I think what we have to distinguish between, in part, is not just the type of fear we're most likely to think of in the context of toxic bosses or organizations, which are economic or career costs, right? Like you'll get fired, you'll get blackballed. But there are these other kinds of risks, social fear. I don't want to be ostracized. I don't want to be the outlier. I don't want to be left alone. And that's an extremely powerful fear. I mean, if you think about our time on Earth, right, we evolved essentially in small clans or bands or tribes. And our task daily was survival related. And to be kicked out of a group actually, meant certain death. And so while that's obviously not true literally for us today, our brains in many respects are downright terrified of exclusion. And so I work for, take for example, a context of for-profit banks versus non-profit credit unions in the U.S. Similar kinds of banking services, but very fundamentally different in their size and this legal status, et cetera. And in banks, not surprisingly, right, this sort of career economic fear often looms large, right? They are known in many cases for having these tougher cultures. But conversely, when I work with folks from credit unions, they have similar difficulties in speaking up. And when you sort of push at and unpack why that is, what you end up finding out is, we've always prided ourselves as being a family. We're smaller. Everybody works here forever. Nobody leaves. And in
Right.
that context, telling the truth about, poor performance or
Yeah.
inappropriate behavior is extremely hard. Not so much because you think you'd be fired, but because it's extremely difficult to confront friends, people
Yeah.
who've
You'd be
essentially
like
become
considered a bit
family.
disloyal, right? In some
Yeah,
ways. And yeah.
you're going against the grain. And so, if you take another context where you would hope we'd be more free speaking, science context, whether it's academic settings or pharmaceutical biotech, I mean, there you would think that the norms of the place should actually be free exchange of ideas based on logic and data. There's huge fear of speaking up in these environments. Some of it's social, some of it's psychological, right? So it's this sense of my identity is based on being smart. My identity is based on sort of being known to do things well. And if you ask me to step out of the box, and maybe try research in a different area or undertake a new method or whatever the case, now the big risk might not be being fired or ostracized. Now the risk is I feel like an idiot, a fool. I got out of my comfort zone and looked stupid. So I think the reason we don't see nearly as much courage as we would hope for, the kinds of behaviors, right, that we would want as much as we'd hope for, is each environment presents different kinds of risks or fears.
Yes.
And there are very, very few that have sort of skillfully figured out how to eliminate most or all of those risks.
And if you were talking to a CEO about this topic, and she or he said, "Look, I think we've got an issue here in the way you've just described, but I'm not sure how much it matters." Right, so there's a human part of me which I get the fact that I want to have an
Yeah.
environment where people can speak up. But tell me a bit more in a nutshell about what impact does it have on companies or organisations of not of large groups of people living in fear and not being able to speak up?
Yeah, it's a great question. In fact, I start a lot of my sessions with folks in organizations presenting sort of a case of, more than half of folks saying it's not safe or worthwhile to speak up, and asking them, what should you do? And then when we finish that exercise, I say, well, let's assume that some version of this little case study described your organization. What are the implications? What does it matter? And, pretty quickly, actually, people come up with the same things I'm about to say to you. They say, well, at the individual level, why it matters is, not only do I sort of feel inauthentic, but I feel less motivated, less committed. I feel like, why bother? And I only bring sort of part of myself to work. So what I would say to the CEO is, well, if you're comfortable with the idea that all you're getting out of your people is the sort of in-role required behavior that you can, hold them accountable for, if you think that's enough in a competitive environment, okay, don't worry about this. But if you actually think it matters, if the whole person is showing up with their best ideas and their full energy and their real commitment, then you have to care about this. Another reason directly related to sort of the individual level is the best people will always have opportunities, and they'll simply walk away if that's the environment you create.
Yes.
They won't
Yes.
stay. So if you care about your best, most creative people staying, you better care. Then I think you can turn to sort of the the business side of it, the more direct business side of it. I'd say, hey, Mr. and Miss CEO, you're 5, 6, 8 levels away from your core customers, from your core suppliers, from your sort of the core work that your organization does. And if you think you can possibly know or know quickly enough what's wrong, you're wrong. The people who know what's going on, both problems that have to be addressed or opportunities to be pursued, are not the people sitting up there in the ivory tower, the C-suite. No disrespect, but that's just the way it works. You're too far removed. And so the very ability for your business to thrive in the future depends on you creating at all levels the ability and the willingness of people to tell you the truth. And on that line, it really is the case if you say, like, well, what's one of the fundamental barriers to sort of getting senior leaders to be more serious about it? I think it's a implicit belief that none of them want to admit, which is, well, we're smarter than the rest of you. We know more.
Yes.
And
Yes.
if you're stuck in that belief system, I mean, I'm clear it's dead wrong, but if you're stuck in that belief system, then why give up your power or why take the time and energy? Because it's
very
messy, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very widespread, even though it may not be. They may not always intentionally do it. I think they may have been grown up in that environment.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very compelling case, and I agree wholeheartedly with that. I guess over the last couple of years, we've been undergoing a forced experiment, if you like, in terms of shifting to more hybrid working. And for some people, that's, whether it's because of their mindset, their age, their background, it's like, hey, try something new, that's fine. For other people, it's been uncomfortable at times. I'm wondering what that shift has done for speaking up, feeling courageous. Has it made it harder?
So my sense, like as I said a few minutes ago, it's both. Both are true. I think for some people, the pandemic and the move to working from home has been freeing. It's made it clear to folks that there are other things in their life more important than that organization or that boss's approval, and so that would go in the column of easier to speak up. You could say that the actual like physical distance makes it somewhat easier to speak up. One thing we know is true is that all too often when people have to speak up in person, they have to do it on the person with higher powers turf, right? So,
Yes,
like
yes.
a boss can say, oh, I have an open door policy. And well, that's fine. But the reality of an open door policy is it's your office, right? It's your door.
Yeah.
And so
you have the power.
yeah, and when people come into your office, right, they see the picture of your family and the awards you've won, and they see you sitting in your $2,000 chair while you get the little wooden one, and so there are a lot of cues in person that when you put everybody just in a little box on Zoom, those power cues dissipate. So that would be a feature that would lead you to say maybe it's a bit more egalitarian, right? There's no rectangular table on Zoom where the boss is clearly at the head. So those things might say speaking up would be easier and people would be more willing. And indeed, I don't know what's happened more recently, but it's about 6 months into the pandemic. There was some data that came out of the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the U.S., that whistleblowing events had actually gone up significantly at the start of the pandemic. And again, nobody knew exactly why, but the logic seemed to be, perhaps people have rethought their priorities or they feel just slightly safer from that detached distance. I think, though, we have to be honest and say there's a flip side to it, too, which is, we as humans are really attuned to sort of cues of whether the other party is trustworthy, to whether the other party is receiving what we're saying well through body language cues, etc. And those things decrease for sure in a Zoom environment, right?
Yes,
In a Zoom
yes.
environment, it's a much thinner medium of communication, so I have to do more guesswork about how you're feeling. It's harder for me if I don't think it went particularly well to just follow up with you quickly by stopping by your office,
Indeed, yes.
right? So,
You have to
so
be
I
a lot more intentional, don't you, with your
you
actions
do,
and the behaviours?
and I think in particular, what matters, what is almost certainly a big decider of sort of how you land on this is what was the relationship you had before the pandemic, before we went to Zoom, right? So if you and I already had a strong, trusting relationship, we probably could operate okay in general on Zoom, and I might be willing to, continue or start to push back a little bit online. If I never even worked for you before, we didn't know each other, I'm a new employee, or we didn't have that much trust before, Zoom is not a great medium for building trust, and trust is pretty darn important to whether people are willing to
Yes.
take risk. And so I think, you can easily make a case for conditions under which people be a bit more willing. You can also certainly make the case that certainly for newer or more distant relationships, I think it's probably harder.
Yes, yes, indeed. I guess during the period of the pandemic, and indeed, if you look back at history, leaders have, if you like, been courageous at times of crisis, whether it's been shocking events or difficulties. They stand up and they say, this is not good enough, we need to change. We've seen events, sadly, in the US and UK and elsewhere, where they've sort of, in a way, been compelled to do it. It would be hard for them not to.
Yeah.
The question I ask, though, is a lot of the features, whether it's about societal behaviour, whether it's about ethical behaviour in an organisation, or something just wrong, is still there in the day-to-day, the sort of the status quo. But I'm curious about what stops people when they're not in a crisis situation actually both recognising what needs to change and then actually stepping up and being courageous and say, right, enough's enough. We need to start taking action. What is it that stops them?
Yeah, I don't think it's a very, maybe isn't the most popular or pleasant sounding thing to say, but I think it basically boils down to self-interest. When we're in a status quo, things are rolling along fine. I'm not feeling a huge amount of pressure around anything specific. The forces basically holding me in place, keeping on, are just stronger than the forces for change. Then suddenly, right, something in the external environment changes that equation. And now actually it's in my self-interest to say something. And I think, if you look in the U.S., for example, in the wake of the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, the tragic deaths of yet more black people at the hands of police, there again was this moment of strong external pressure. And sure, you indeed saw more executives speaking out about this.
Yes.
And, do I think that suddenly people who were terrible human beings who didn't care about this cared about it? No, I don't think that. I think you either before those moments cared and for whatever reason were not speaking up about it publicly or taking much action, or you still didn't really care, but now the pressures of the external environment led you to realize you better performatively make some optics changes. And so often I think, sadly, it's just self-interest. I think maybe a slightly more optimistic addition would be, there's strength in numbers. And so if it would be very hard to stick your neck out alone on something, it's just simply easier once, the forces around you lead to a bit of cover for making changes. Because we don't have to demonize executives to explain this phenomenon. I mean, there might be many executives in the U.S. who feel strongly about social issues, gun control, all the issues, right, that sort of
Yes.
make the news these days. Some of it's just a conscious calculation, no matter how sort of good a person they are, it's a calculation about saying what percentage of our customer base, our broader shareholder base, our regulatory environment is going to be with or against me if I speak
Yes.
out. And when you get a broad societal movement, it can be easier and clearer. But I actually think the evidence on this broader issue is clear to me, and that is that crises don't crises we sometimes make the mistake of saying crises, build character. Uh, I think the truth is crises reveal character. So, you are who you are. Executive's not suddenly a totally different person. None of us are 3 months into the pandemic. You know, we might over a course of many, many years be shaped by a crisis we went
Sure,
through.
sure.
But a lot of the behavior you see in a crisis is not some sudden, like, they just got the religion on a given issue. I think it's that the calculation changes in those
Yeah,
moments.
that's a great way to put it. I want to delve a bit more into team dynamics because I've been working with some executive teams where this topic of speaking up has come up in a number of guises. Not because there's been toxicity, or at least not apparent toxicity, and the business is doing fine, but there's a sense of we want to do even better. We want to really grow. We've got a great opportunity. This is the CEO. I'm not sure that my team are saying what they really think. It's not obvious fear because people do talk. They get on well with each other, probably too well with each other. But the question in unlocking the leadership potential of this group and indeed the layers that go underneath them is what are the first steps I can take to actually encourage people to be more courageous in perhaps having an alternative view or to challenge my own wisdom or just come up with something that's a bit far-fetched? Where would you, let's get practical now. And your book is very practical. And I know you're a practical guy as well as being an academic. Where would you start?
So I think, if I was in that role and I really just wanted to get people talking, I would use some questions, some frames that allowed people to start being honest about that, but without having to, to make it sound like what they were doing was directly saying, okay, boss, here's how you're at fault or here's your problems. And
Right.
So a couple, for example, I think really good starting points could be, my advisor, Chris Ardress, one of my advisors used to talk about discussing the undiscussables. And so one question I've sometimes posed now to groups is, and it gets people to laugh, which I think is always a good start to getting people to be a little more open, is to post, put up on the board or say verbally, what things would we discuss if we decided that the undiscussables now needed to be discussed rather than be undiscussable? And of course, right? People laugh at that, but they immediately know what you're saying.
Yeah. Indeed.
And essentially, just getting people to say, these things feel like undiscussables is kind of a roundabout way of giving permission.
Yes.
Because when you frame it that way, somehow it sounds like you're acknowledging that the culture somehow has made these undiscussable, but you're inviting sort of them to sort of name topics. Another frame that I use all the time with folks who kind of lead at any level is I introduce them to the notion of the folly of hoping for A while rewarding B. This is, an old management concept from Steve Kerr. I think 1975 he wrote about this, and he said, he was a consultant. He said, I go in all these organizations, and they say they really want collaborative behavior. And they really want long-term strategic thinking, and they really want ethical behavior. And then I ask them, well, tell me, for example, how your reward system is designed. And they say it's based on 100% on individual performance
There you go.
in a short-term window with little attention paid to how you got the results. And so, he says, and I say to them, well, that's the folly of hoping for A while rewarding B. And so
Classic.
I think a great question that you can ask people at any level in an organization is, what are the follies around here? What are the things we say are important, but our system, structures, practices don't actually support? It's another way that, for whatever reason, does not feel as threatening for people to answer. And maybe it's because you're attacking, if you will, systems and processes rather than people. But I think so. I think one piece of advice would be to say, if you're an executive in particular, don't go into the room and say, I want you to tell me my 4 biggest flaws today. That's pretty tough. That's a tough task for people. But I think if you, in these other kinds of ways, basically frame it as just what are the things we should be talking about but don't. What are the things we You can often talk about, Jeff Pfeffer and others have talked about like the knowing doing gap, like, what do we say is important, but we don't actually do, or what do we know how to do, but for whatever reason don't actually implement it. Any kind of question that feels like you're not asking people to personally criticize the target, the asker, but instead to just describe the place, are really good places to start.
I really like that, and that's it's a lot less direct, easier to contribute, and they use the word "we" a lot. It's right. A shared problem or shared discovery, and I guess you have to sustain it. Because I've been involved in initiatives where you have those conversations, and they're good conversations, but I wouldn't say it's theatre, but they're one-offs. So I guess one of the leadership challenges is to continue to have that curiosity throughout. Is that right?
Oh, no question. I mean, sadly, the majority of instances where I have been brought in over the last 15 years, let's say, to work with or talk with an organization about the problem of speaking up or safety in the environment, stems from the same source, which is we did our annual climate employee survey. And you get all the firms do these, and then they give you the report back, and it's got 12, depends on the company, but 12 or 15 or 18 different categories, right? And most of the time, an impetus for me being brought in is like climate for safe to speak up and challenge traditional ways got ranked in the bottom 2 on this climate survey, right? Yes. And so then then the classic sort of theater behavior kicks in. Well, we're going to start a task force for the 2 lowest scoring areas, and we're going to spend a little time and money on it, and we're going to wave our hand a little bit about it. But then to your point, in reality, frankly, when next year's climate survey comes, we'll probably pick 2 more pieces of performance art to work on for a while. And so, I think you're right. The question isn't like whether an executive knows enough to take some obligatory action when they get that data, but it's whether they're committed to doing what it would take to like change it in a systemic way. And that's not just about how long do they sort of stay involved in terms of, public statements that this is a priority for them or other more symbolic moves, but it's also actually whether they continue to shift the structures and policies that that are at the underlying level the problem, right? Like you can say all you want as an executive about I want more honesty, I want, we need naysayers in the interest of innovation, but people have eyes. And so if they see that in the top 2 levels of the entire company, almost everybody they know who's there got there by being a yes man or woman, it's really not going to matter, right? It's not going to matter if you say we don't want, we don't accept toxic, rigid, closed-minded leaders anymore. If you never change the performance evaluation system in a very forceful way to say we will measure these behaviors, like how good are you at being open to voice, soliciting voice, taking action on things brought to you, creating a safe environment. If you don't measure that and then actually have policies that say, for example, beyond this, level 2 management, you cannot get promoted if you're below a certain level. Right? Like
it's that coherence, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you often see salespeople be promoted based on their direct commercial results, but they leave a trail of collateral damage. Even though the top of the shop would be, we need to do all these things that you just described.
No question.
And it's that lack of coherence. And I guess it links to a point, which is I see quite a lot of C-suite executives and others take action where the issue is in their face, or there's a big initiative to launch, as you just described. But it's that some of the time it's the microaggressions, particularly, and this comes up with some of the research and collaboration I've been doing in the area of inclusion and diversity. Even, as a white male, I've been trying to learn more about it, both professionally and personally. My wife's of Indian heritage. In some ways, they may be smaller in the moment, but actually, if they are pervasive, they can have a bigger impact. Particularly those who feel less of a sense of inclusion and belonging in an organisation.
No question.
But in some ways, it's also where do you start? Where it's so small and day to day versus something where somebody might have just done something wrong, where you can just fire them, or there's a division that needs to be shut down and so on. How do you tackle the micro behaviours that actually get in the way of progress?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing you have to, I mean, I'll go to, I think, sort of what you can do about it, but let me actually start by saying I think the first thing you have to do is we have to have some humility and perspective about what's micro to whom. Um, if I'm a relatively low level employee without, let's say formal power, not a lot of status, you know, I don't show up at a meeting expecting that I'm going to be involved in making major strategic decisions for the firm, right? So if you cut me out of that, in a sense, that's not a micro or macro aggression to me as that lower level
Yeah,
person.
that's a great point.
But if somebody explicitly makes a comment that sort of, demeans a core part of my identity, that's a pretty damn big deal to me. And so,
Mm.
some of it is, I think, having the humility to say what is a big hurtful thing to some is different than it is for another. So even just thinking about the
So,
labeling. Now, to the substance of
that's a
the
good point.
issue, um, I think the truth is, if you say, well, why are some executives able to, bet billions of dollars or make big decisions involving a lot of people, but they can't even confront a microaggression? Part of the answer is awareness. So they don't even recognize microaggressions in the first place, and everybody's too afraid to tell them they just made a microaggression. Second, they don't have the tools, right? If you go to business school or you work in business long enough, let's say you're thinking about a big investment. Well, you know all the models to run, right? You've got reams of data in front of you with
Yes, yes.
analytics about why this is good or bad, and so you feel, even though it's a big decision, monetarily, you feel equipped
Mm.
and responsible for that. And what I see too often is now it comes to an issue, a race or a gender-based, let's say, microaggression. Um, well, who taught you any tools for that? Um,
Yes, yes.
now you're afraid. You think it would be awkward. You're worried that what appears to be this big an issue is going to get this big if you actually raise it. I think we have to be honest that just because a decision is of bigger magnitude, let's say in its potential outcomes or its dollar figure or pound figure amount, that doesn't mean in the eyes of an executive or manager at any level they feel more prepared to handle it, or less prepared, right? And so, I was actually quite interested in the issue, and so in a number of my classes in the last couple of years, I built a case that essentially said, imagine you work for a place that has gotten a lot more diverse in the last few years. Now
Mm.
has 40% women and, this percent and this and that, whatever, diversity. However, there are still lots of evidence that while it's become a lot more diverse, it still doesn't feel truly inclusive to many.
Mm.
And the evidence I lay out there is that, women, minorities, LGBT, all of these different identity groups are 2-3 times more likely to report being dissatisfied with the firm on the annual employee survey. So the
Mm.
task I give students is prepare and be ready to deliver a set of recommendations to senior leadership about how to make the place more truly inclusive. So they get some time to do that, and they come. And then I invite 2 executive guests, and one is a male and one's a female, and sometimes it's a black female. But they are introduced to the class as of equally senior power. They're like senior VP, senior VP. And this
Yes.
is the panel. What the students don't know is that I've actually asked the white male guest to start the meeting by turning to his female colleague and say, "Hey, sweetie, take the notes here, okay?" And then to embed 2 or 3 more microaggressions as the thing goes along. So, for example, as students make recommendations about things related to gender equity or whatever, the female guest, gets very passionate about those issues, and I've asked, the male executive guest to say things like to the students like, "Oh, don't mind her; she gets overly emotional, women."
Right.
So a couple comments like that, and what I have learned then in processing this, and I also have done this as an individual simulation, is that only about 50% of the microaggressions made even get noticed.
Right. There
Many
you
of them
go.
just go right past, and people will try to deny it. I'm sure they didn't say that in mine, and I say, watch the video. And then they come back, all, tail between the legs.
Fascinating.
And then I say, and then it turns out that 20% or less of the microaggressions get addressed meaning anybody actually says anything.
Right. So the funnel gets pretty,
Yeah,
it's
the
pretty
fun.
small.
And then
Yeah.
when you
Yeah.
talk about like, why didn't you? You noticed it. Why didn't you? Then all the rationalizations kick in. Well, I was here trying to get resources for the problem, and I didn't want to derail it with this, and I didn't know what to say, and I did. And essentially, what comes out is I didn't know how to do something that felt like it might help, or at least not make the situation worse. And that's a great point at which I can then intervene and say, well, here are some tools, and here are some techniques. But the reality is, we'd like to think it's different, but most of us didn't grow up in environments that taught us how to successfully handle these kinds of
Yeah, yeah.
moments.
That's a brilliant story, and brilliantly crafted in terms of how you set that up. Just to extend that point once more with one more question, which is, if you do feel you have the tools and you have the inclination to speak up and be courageous, I still see people, even with that, getting too emotional, whether they're female or male, I hasten to add,
Oh, yeah.
and losing control, whether it's pent up frustration, whether it's the commitment to the cause, whatever it is, they actually diminish their contribution because they're not, in your words, competently courageous. How do you handle that when you want to be courageous, but actually you're not sure whether you can control it in the moment?
Yeah. Well, I think, the first step actually is to admit clearly that you in that instance are the one who has the problem, and then to begin to understand what that's about and what you can do about it. And what I mean by that, the way I've worked with students, executives on this issue is I show them a visual. I say, this is like this is Jim Detert's emotions in a nutshell lesson. And what I basically say is, okay, there's a stimulus, like somebody says something offensive in a meeting. Okay, that's the stimulus. And then we have this immediate emotional reaction, right? And that's amygdala driven. That's, back brain driven. And I say that you can't control. That happens before consciousness kicks in. It's very automatic. None of us know how to stop that. But here's the thing. From that point on, it's all about you.
Yes.
Because from that moment on, after your initial reaction to the stimulus, which you can't control, but you haven't said anything yet either in that moment. You've just had that flash, let's say, of anger. You can control the rest. And the way I describe it and sort of show it visually to people is I say you have to think about two sort of paths. One path is you take that initial emotional reaction and you yourself throw fire on it. You put more fuel. And the way we do that, in cognitive behavioral terms is we catastrophize, we engage in all or nothing thinking. Like a boss says something critical, and instead of saying like, that was a problematic comment, or maybe she's having a bad day, we say, she's the biggest blah, blah, blah ever, or she always acts like this, or he's such a blah, blah, blah. And those statements take your little fire, and now it's a bonfire.
Yes. Yes.
But conversely, in that moment, right, we could learn to stop ourselves. And some of it is, the classical, like it's just like old wisdom, right? Like take 3 deep breaths or do other things to just pause. Because if you can get yourself to just pause in that moment, you then could begin to enact the strategies that take you on this sort of defuel the fire path, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
you could learn to recognize I'm having an emotional reaction out of proportion to the issue. Breathe. You could learn to say I'm catastrophizing, generalizing, blah, blah, blah. Stop. And you could teach yourself particular strategies and phrases like, let me inquire. So rather than jump to the conclusion that he or she is a blah, 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 what
Let
if
me find out about it.
what if instead my initial strategy, every time I heard something that like led to this bolt of anger, what if I adopted a strategy? Like one of the things I've tried to do in class when this happens, students will often say, Jim, you say your strategy is, because what I've learned over time is that if I hear something that like strikes me as crazy, and that I have an initial reaction to, just the act of saying, that's interesting. So that's the phrase I go to, that's interesting. Just that little slowdown usually allows me to then say, could you help us understand where that came from? Or could you say more? Or,
Yes.
So I think all of us have the we all have the wherewithal to develop over time the ability to recognize, like after the initial flare of emotion, we do have choices. We can
Yes, I
learn.
love
We
that.
can learn
Yeah,
what to
yeah.
do. And I talk about
You've
some of that in the
been
book, as you know.
Indeed, I'm giving them a taster without giving them too much.
Yeah.
They have to read it, have to buy it and read it. You've been staying in the UK too long, Jim, if you've been saying, interesting, because interesting in the UK can mean a million different things. I mean, as we draw to a close, I always ask guests a couple of quick questions about you as an individual. And two things, very simple questions, of course. One is, how do you measure your own impact? And secondly, when you do your best work, whether it's consulting in the way, teaching, speaking, and writing and researching papers, but you're having your best day, you're doing your best work, what are the one or two habits that you've been using to do that work? So how do you measure your impact, and what are your best habits?
I measure impact, and I realize in saying this, it's, in a sense, it's the least scientific way to do it, but by the individual feedback I get. And it's feedback, frankly, that comes over a more distant time, right? So, many of us who teach or consult, right, we have figured out, right, the formula of how to, get the 5.0 eval on the program, right? And
Yes.
that's, of course, a lot to do with just sort of in the moment. How do people feel about what we said or did? But in the end, I'm under no illusion at all, actually, that that's a real sign of impact. For me, impact comes when I am fortunate enough that somebody sends me an email or a letter or whatever and says, I want to share with you. I teach a course. My course, the course I teach the most is called Defining Moments, and it's a course that introduces students. It puts them in the position of other leaders having defining moments and says, what would you do and why and how? And it's a very interactive class. And
Brilliant.
so I'll get feedback that says, either in a defining moment language or in a courage language that says, hey, my defining moment came last week. And because of the impetus of your class or the tools I had learned, I was ready, and this time I took it. And
Wonderful.
here's what happened.
Wonderful.
And all variants of that sort of. And so to me, it's not how many people can buy a book or, rate a course well. It's actually when people tell me, like, this literally changed the path I was on. That's how I measure my
Fantastic.
impact.
That's fantastic. And then your habits, one or two habits that people can learn from, if it's not too personal.
I wish I had something that felt too personal to tell you, because that might be more interesting. I think for me, maybe just a couple things that really facilitate good work for me are, one, sort of shutting. My work involves primarily like the life of the mind, right? And so for me, creating a very quiet environment. So I don't like to write or read or think with music playing in the background or a lot of other noise. I need silence. I've learned that about myself. I've also learned that I'm much more productive if I've exercised, done something, and exercised and gotten fresh air. And I think more and more the research is becoming clear. I just read something recently that said, we used to think, you have to exercise, X number of minutes a week. But now the research is starting to say that if you did that exercise solely on a treadmill indoor, for example, it's nowhere near as good for you as if you did the equivalent amount outside. And so there's clearly something about breathing fresh air, about being in sun that matters. So exercise. But honestly, the third thing is I read tons of books over the years on sort of how to write, by world famous authors and academics, whatever, how to write. And as you would guess, there's variance on almost every dimension, right? Some people say I write with a suit. Some people say I write naked. I mean, there's huge variance on habits. But here's the one thing on which there was really almost no variance. Get your butt in the chair. So this notion of, like, forget about this idea that writers or thinkers, wait for inspiration and then crank it all out. There's almost universal agreement. That's not true. You end up doing good work when you simply commit to getting your butt in the chair and doing work every day.
Yeah, I love that. Love that.
And when I wrote, for example, Choosing Courage, the particular strategy I use, which I now would advise anybody on, is I told myself, when you think about a big project, whether it's a book or anything else, often people they don't start because it feels too daunting, it feels too big. So I on a piece of paper in Excel, I made a thing with just hundreds of the number 15, and I told myself when I started the book I was going to work on it 15 minutes a day without fail. Because there was no way I could possibly say I didn't have 15 minutes in a day. I mean, my God, everybody has 15 minutes. Yeah. But it turned out that by allowing myself to think I only had to work for 15 minutes, on the vast majority of days I would get in the flow and work a lot longer. So I think sometimes our best work comes by creating not just a habit, but breaking it down into sort of manageable chunks that decrease the anxiety enough to just allow the opportunity to get into a flow.
That's brilliant. You're practicing what you preached earlier in terms of breaking down the barriers between people. So, for example, when an executive is saying what's wrong, you break it down into something that's more accessible. So, while you're one of these people who practices what you research and you speak about, which is refreshing. Jim, that was a wonderful, stimulating conversation. I've taken a lot away. I loved your eloquence, your clarity, and everything else. So thanks for coming on the show. Thank you. That was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. If you've enjoyed the conversation, please do subscribe to the YouTube channel and to the podcast so you get alerted to more content. And if you're there and you enjoy it, please do give us a great rating. And please do check out the other interviews in this series. Thank you ever so much, Jim. Thank you.